Hello, and welcome to Episode 1 of Sorastro's Zombicide Black Plague painting series. In this episode, we're going to paint the three basic zombie types, the walkers, runners, and fatties, from Cool Mini or Not's Zombicide Black Plague. Painting a shambling horde of zombies is a great way to get started in miniature painting, as they're fun, easy, and forgiving miniatures to paint. Because we want a grim and grungy look, we can get away with using a single dark shade for the entire miniature. We also only need a limited amount of highlighting. And any mistakes we make can simply be covered with blood. For this tutorial, I'm using mostly a size 2 brush by Rosemary Co, and a mixture of paints by Citadel, Vallejo, and Army Painter, and you should of course use any paint range and colours you like. Far from being a strict guide, the aim of this video is simply to present a range of ideas and options that painters of any level should be able to draw from to get our Black Plague zombies painted up and looking great on the tabletop. With that out of the way, let's look at the main steps we'll be using to paint our zombies. We're going to begin by spraying the zombies with a primer. We'll look at the time-saving benefits of using coloured primers, but I'll also be showing the benefits of using just plain white. We'll then apply neat, flat base colours for the clothes, and, for zombies that haven't been primed with a colour primer, we'll explore a range of effective skin tones. We'll also look at a possible colour scheme for the bases. We'll then create a nice bit of depth in the shadows by shading the miniatures with a single wash or a shader, and I'll be comparing a range of products that you could use to do this. We'll then finish the zombies off with some optional finishing touches, including some limited highlights for the skin, glowing eyes, and of course, adding some blood. Let's begin. Although the mould lines on the Zombicide miniatures are pretty discreet, there may be one or two you might like to scrape off with a file or the edge of a craft knife, such as we see here running down the side of this fattie's arm. Next, we need to prepare the miniature for painting by spraying on a primer. Most of the time we might use either black or white, depending on whether the overall look of the miniature is going to be dark or light. However, there are some coloured primers, like the ones I'm using by Army Painter, that also provide us with an effective base skin tone for our zombies, which will save us having to paint those areas later on. I'm going to use a combination of different primers to show the different results that can be achieved, but you should of course use whichever primer you like or have access to, or indeed use an airbrush. I'm going to spray some of my zombies with the necrotic flesh primer, which will result in a greenish skin colour. I'm going to spray others using skeleton bone, which will produce a beige-coloured finish. And I'm going to spray the remaining zombies white, over which I'll be painting my own skin tones in the next stage, such as the pale blue example we can see here. When priming, you ideally want to be in a well-ventilated area, and rubber gloves and a breathing mask would also be useful. Whatever primer you use, it's important to follow the instructions, which will usually tell you to shake the can for a good while before spraying, and what kind of distance you need to spray from. I'm applying light, even sprays from a couple of angles to a whole batch of zombies at a time. Just remember that it's better to slightly underspray than to overspray a miniature, as missing patches can always be touched up with a brush later on, but spraying too much could destroy the details. Once dry, I like to check each one individually and give an additional blast to hit any remaining areas that may have been missed. When you're done, it's a good idea to invert the can and spray until no more paint comes out to help prevent blockage. Now the zombies are primed, we're ready to begin painting. Any zombies not primed with a colour primer will now need to have their skin painted, and you could get really creative with your choice of tone. However, if you like the greenish look of the necrotic flesh, then either Army Painter's Plague Skin or Citadel's Nurgling Green will give a good match. For a beige look similar to the Skeleton Bone primer, then something like Carrickstone or Ushabti Bone would be fine. A whole range of other skin tones are also possible, and experimenting with different colours can be a fun process. Just remember that pale colours will work best, and whatever colour you use will turn out a fair bit darker and more brown once we've added some shade. Here, for example, you can see the effect achieved using Citadel's Pallid Witch Flesh as a base tone, and after the shade, and finishing touches. Light grey tones, such as Ulthuan Grey, can also give us a beautifully lifeless skin tone. Pale purples and blues can also work very well. Here I've used Vallejo's Pale Blue, and this is the tone I favoured for the majority of my non-colour primed zombies. Before painting, it's a good idea to find a way to mount your miniature, such as with some white tack and a bottle cap, to avoid having to handle the miniature directly. Whatever colour you use, don't forget to thin the paint with a couple of drops of water so we don't smother any details. Depending on the paint, you will most likely need to apply 2 or 3 layers to achieve a strong, even tone. Even if you have colour primed your zombies, you may still like to vary the skin tone of at least some of them, for the sake of a little variety. If you do choose a range of skin tones, it might be useful to mark the initials of the colours used on the underside of each base, just in case you forget which is which when it comes to adding the highlights. However you choose to paint the skin, once done, you will now need to paint the clothes, again using whatever colours you like. The colours we might pick here may depend on the kind of life we imagine our medieval zombies had before being turned. We might pick drab, earthy colours for an ex-peasant, for example, sticking to pale beiges, white and mid-tone browns, the colours of undyed cloth, linen, wool and leather. A middle-class zombie might have been able to afford to dye their clothes blue, green, or even red. Purple, however, is a colour we would expect to be seen worn only by royalty or the Pope, and I'll be reserving the colour purple just for the necromancer, which we'll be covering in a future episode. We might want to add some simple bold patterns for zombies that may have been wearing colours denoting allegiance to a certain house or faction. Or even paint on some striped patterns, as was popular in the late Middle Ages, particularly for the leggings. We might also imagine what the court jester may have been wearing the night he drew his last breath. Using bold primary colours like this helps to add some vibrancy to a grey world, and nicely reflects the pageantry of the age. It also throws into relief the grim horror of what has befallen these innocent village and townsfolk. Although I've given a suggestion of some of the main colours I've chosen, I would encourage you to have a go at experimenting with colour schemes of your own, as it can be such a creative and rewarding process. However, a more concise record of some of the schemes I came up with can be found in the appendix at the end of this video. Whatever colours you do choose, it's a good idea to compensate for the darkening effect of the shade we'll be adding in the next step, by using generally mid to light coloured base tones. This means the shade will still be able to darken the recesses down further, giving us a stronger sense of definition and contrast. Other general tips include painting your zombies in batches and applying one particular colour to different parts of a group of zombies to save time. I might, for example, use this blue to paint the tunic of one zombie and then the leggings of another, and so on. This will help to speed up the process whilst also help to ensure that no two zombies will look alike. It's also a good idea to paint the belts first, as it's much easier to achieve a neat join by painting the surrounding area of fabric than it is to paint the thin bit of rope. I also like to place contrasting colours or colours with contrasting levels of brightness next to one another. Or, if I do have adjacent areas of a similar darkness, I might add a contrasting trim to break the miniature up. Finally, for the fatties, it's a good idea to paint the tongue before the teeth with a light pink. Then we can hit the teeth with some pure white. Painting on the base colours is by far the most time-consuming stage of the whole process, but painting in batches of around 10 zombies would be a good way to break the task up. What's really needed though is a little patience and a simple enjoyment of the process. Before moving on, you now need to make a decision about the base. The easiest thing to do would be to paint them a plain flat colour, such as grey or beige. You might even want to use a different colour for each zombie type to make them easier to identify on the board. If this is the approach you choose, you can do this in the finishing touches stage, so that any splatter from the shade gets painted over. Alternatively, you could replace the base entirely with a clear one, which looks fantastic but does render the miniature more fragile as a result. You can reference my previous zombie painting guides for more detail on how to do this. The approach I've chosen for my Black Plague miniatures is to paint on a textured effect, so that the zombies look more thematic and also blend in a little better with the board. This looks more attractive than a plain base, but is not as fragile as a rebased miniature, and you could still use separate colours for the rims of each zombie type should you wish. Before painting the bases, I'm going to mount each zombie onto a spare paint pot using some white tack. This only takes a couple of minutes, but will make the base painting and shading step so much easier and cleaner. Here are the steps I'm using to paint my bases. I'm starting with a base colour of Rakarth Flesh, and I'm using a larger brush to speed things up. I'm then using some Storm Vermin Fur to paint on some cracks to create a flagstone effect. This can include a mixture of regular and irregular patterns, along with a few smaller cracks within some of the individual flagstones. Once that's done, I'm going to pick out some of the flagstones using two different lighter tones to create some variety. I'm starting with some thinned Screaming Skull, and painting around 3 random flagstones on each base. The finish doesn't have to be especially flat or neat here, as the board itself has quite a painterly illustrative style. Bear in mind that the shade we'll be adding in the next step will both darken the base and mute the contrast. I'm then doing the same with some Pallid Witch Flesh, although you may find other colours that work just as well. To finish the bases off, I'm painting the rim with a dark brown, although, as mentioned, many painters like to use a separate colour for each zombie type, for ease of identification. Once shaded, the finished result should give us a palette that broadly matches the tones on the board, and, although it may add another hour or two onto the painting time, really adds to the overall look of the models. Once the base colours are complete, we're ready to do some shading. Now we need to use a shade or wash to darken the recesses of the miniature, which would often mean using a different coloured wash for each colour on the miniature, and this is certainly an approach you may wish to consider. A green wash, such as Army Painter's Plague Shader for example, would do a fine job of producing a vibrant green skin tone when used over the necrotic flesh. A blue shade, such as Drakenhof Nightshade, used over this wolf grey, gives a nice deep blue tone in the recesses. However, for a large group of unclean zombies, we can happily save a lot of time by using a single generic dark brown wash for the entire miniature. There are several products we could use to do this, and I'm going to try out a small selection on some test zombies so we can compare the results. On one zombie, I'm applying some of Army Painter's Deep Shader. As with most washes, we simply apply it undiluted with a large brush, letting the wash settle into the recesses before soaking up any excess. For the second zombie, I'm mixing equal quantities of Citadel's Agrax Earthshade with some Nuln Oil, both of which now come in extra large sizes. Finally, I'm applying some of Army Painter's Strong Tone Quick Shade to zombie number 3. We apply this like a wash, but because it's so thick, we will need to spend a little longer soaking up the excess. And, because it dries to a high gloss, we also need to apply a matte varnish to take the shine off. Looking at the results along with an unshaded zombie for comparison, we can see that both the Army Painter and Citadel washes have significantly darkened the entire miniature, with the more expensive Citadel wash doing a pretty fine job of deepening the tone in the recesses, which is particularly noticeable in the facial details. The quick shade, however, produces a more striking level of contrast, giving us deep, opaque levels of shade in the recesses, but allowing more of the original lighter base tone to show through in the raised areas. It's also remarkable just how smoothly the quick shade manages to affect these transitions of dark to light. This means that a figure that's been shaded with quick shade will require little or no highlighting. Using a more traditional wash is still an option if you can't get hold of the quick shade, however, although you may have to do a little more work with your highlights afterward to achieve a good level of contrast. Quick shade is therefore the product I'll be using for my zombies, and although it's ostensibly the most expensive option, the cost per milliliter is actually less than half that of the Citadel washes, and it will also last for years and easily cover several hundred miniatures. Before applying the quick shade, it's a good idea to lay down some paper for wiping the excess onto. You will also need some mineral turpentine, or white spirit as it's called in the UK, to clean your brush with afterwards. After giving the can a good shake, I'm taking a fairly large old brush to begin coating each zombie with the quick shade. For the walkers and runners, around 3 large brushfuls should easily cover the miniature, including the base. Just ensure that the entire surface is coated, as any gaps will look out of place once the quick shade has dried. I'll then spend a minute or so soaking up the excess quick shade, repeatedly dabbing it away and wiping it on the paper. I will then recheck the figure a few minutes later to see if any more quick shade has pooled anywhere it isn't wanted, including around the edge of the feet. We're looking to remove shade from any places where it may be smothering important details, but also from flat or raised parts of the form that we would usually expect to be an area of highlight. At this stage, you might be wondering if you haven't just ruined your lovingly painted zombies, and it does take a small leap of faith to trust that they will look amazing in the end. Once done, they will need to be left for 24 hours to fully cure, during which time they will dry to an extremely durable, high-gloss finish. This level of protection is the reason I've also shaded the rim of the base. To remove the shine, I'm going to use Testa's Dull Coat, although there are several other brands of matte or satin varnish that will also do the job. A couple of even coats from multiple angles will remove that gloss varnish and allow us to see just how effective the quick shade has really been. At this point, you could consider your zombies complete, as we have a durable, richly shaded and varied zombie horde that is perfectly good enough to hit the table. Let's now look at some optional finishing touches you might like to add if you want to take your zombies that bit further. The first finishing touch I'm going to add is some delicate highlights for the skin, focusing mostly on the face area. To do this, I'm using a slightly lighter version of the original base skin tone. So, for the zombies sprayed with necrotic flesh, for example, I'm going to take some plague skin and lighten it by mixing in a little white. I'm thinning the paint slightly more than I did when applying the base colours. I'm then using this to gently emphasise the top of the nose, the cheekbones, and maybe the brow and tip of the chin. This just helps to boost the luminosity of the skin tone and makes the face, and eyes in particular, more of a focal point. Because of the thinness of the paint, I can build these highlights up in a couple of layers, gently increasing the intensity to my liking. I might also pick out 1 or 2 raised details from elsewhere on the miniature. This is quite a subtle touch to add, especially if you've used the quick shade, as the miniature already has quite a strong sense of contrast. But if you've used a traditional wash, it may be a more necessary step to give us the required sense of depth. Likewise, for the zombies with a pale blue skin, I'm once again mixing a little white into the base tone to produce the highlight. For the zombies sprayed with skeleton bone, I'm using some ushabti bone. If you've used a very light colour such as pallid witch flesh or Ulthuan grey for the skin, then a simple reapplication of the base tone without any additional white should be fine. If you haven't used the quick shade, you may also want to highlight some of the clothes in the same way, using the original base colours. But I would avoid over-highlighting these areas, as it's the skin that we really want to stand out the most. The second finishing touch I've chosen to add is some glowing eyes. To do this, I'm simply creating a very pale mix of the colour I want the eyes to be, such as this moot green and white mix, and using it to paint a small dot in each eye socket. It's a good idea to have a dark brown such as Rhinox hide handy to perform any retouching that may be necessary when things go wrong. We could then apply a small amount of a matching coloured glaze, such as Waywatcher green, which we can use unthinned straight out of the bottle. This can cover the actual eye along with some of the surrounding area to heighten the glowing effect. Notice that the colour can appear slightly stronger once the glaze is dry. The same approach could be used for whatever colour you like, such as blue for example. Here I'm applying the light blue mix, followed by the blue glaze. And for one final example, I'm trying out some yellow eyes. With the highlights and eyes complete, I might provide one final protective matte spray before adding some blood, which I'm applying last as I want it to retain a wet, glossy look. For the blood, we could use something like Citadel's Blood for the Blood God, which should be used unthinned and gives us a bright scarlet hue and a glistening finish. However, I'll be using the same recipe as used in my previous zombie painting tutorials, which is some Tamiya Clear Red mixed with a little dark brown and some black. By varying the amount of the brown and black, we can produce a nice range of effects, from older, more dried looking bloodstains to fresh, glistening wounds and spatter. A few drops on the base can also look effective. Applying different amounts of blood to each zombie gives us yet one more way of introducing a nice bit of variety, and also a good opportunity to cover up any scrappy bits of painting we might not be happy with. With that done, our zombie horde is complete. Thank you for watching. Please feel free to like, comment and subscribe. You can also connect with me on Facebook and Twitter to ask questions or share your own work. To support me in my efforts to produce even more content, you can do so by clicking the Patreon link, where you can also gain access to additional behind-the-scenes content. My huge thanks go out to the growing legion of current patrons who are so generously financing all of the work that I do. Join me again soon, as we'll be returning to paint the Necromancer, Abomination, and Heroes from Zombicide Black Plague. Happy painting!